Nottingham, we don't give ourselves credit. I've lived in London for several years. I've lived in Birmingham for several years. These are our big cities in the UK. In Nottingham, we do not give ourselves credit for how much we pioneer here. As I was saying earlier, we pioneered the riots. We were there before Notting Hill riots. It was Nottingham. People are surprised, is it really the first conference of it or event of its kind in the UK? Surely London's done it, surely Manchester's done it, surely Birmingham's done it. No. Here we are in Nottingham at the forefront of things again. Absolutely fantastic, and it's a privilege to be a part of it. So this evening, I've got another amazing lineup, something really quite different for you. And just to let you know, in case it doesn't get mentioned again today, tomorrow we have part 3 of the marathon, which is activist workshops. And I invite you to come along to those if you feel the need to actually get involved from an activist point of view in the issues that we're discussing. But for tonight, anyway, we've got a nice mixture of discussion. So we want you to get involved in the audience discussion. We've got some cerebral gymnastics going on, so because people are going to just really blow your mind with some thoughts about the Black Lives Matter movement, and we've also got some amazing performances for you as well. So I'm going to hand you over to Marissa, aka Chris Riss. For those people are like, what? That's Chris Riss? What? Marissa's Chris Riss? Yes. I don't know. This should show my age now. Can anyone remember Wonder Woman? Oh, this. You remember her? First of all, she was just sort of like dressed like Marissa, looking like an everyday woman. Then she sort of goes on top where nobody can see her. One moment she's Marissa, next moment she's Christmas. So I'm going to hand over to Christmas, who will introduce our first act, and I really want to hear a lot of love for this person as well. So,
hi everybody, welcome. I'm Chris Riss. We've had a great start to the day today, and we are kicking off with our afternoon event, well, our evening event, should I say. Our first act, which we have up, is a Nottingham superstar. He's out there in Nottingham. He's doing a lot of good things. We did a Black Lives Matter music competition, which we launched it all over Nottingham, and we let loads of people, we had loads of entries, we had a few entries, but we also did we had our own eyes peeled for relevant music around Nottingham. And we seen this guy, and he has a piece called Freedom Style of Speech, and he's going to blow off the roof. So welcome, A Nizzy.
DJ. Yeah. We're saying Black Lives Matter. Yeah. Yeah, the world's in crisis. Yeah, I'm talking about innocent lives and government lies and ISIS. Death and fires. Baltimore riots. Another black boy dead from a white man's gun. That's another black son that's dying. That's another black mum that's crying. That's a corrupt police force. And that's way too common. And that's way too regular. Man, that's way too often. Man, that's more than a problem. Come, let me free up the truth. Come, let me state my views. A young black man that's always been stereotyped like this. So now you want to ask me this? Wait. Now you want to ask me this? How do you feel when the sun comes on and a white person says nigga? I ain't gonna lie, I feel uncomfortable. Like, go figure. Cause the way that I think's much bigger. Yeah, I know my roots and my inner, but I'm just a hypocrite. That's a word that I say, that's a word that I use every day. That's a word that's polluted the music. That's a word that can make you cool if you use it. That's a word we're abusing. That's a word we forgot about, a word that we're losing. They invaded and enslaved us. They took diamonds, they took gold. They invaded and enslaved us. They raped us and they took diamonds, they took. We ain't building like the Asians. See a black brother doing well and we get jealous, we start hating. That's the slave master's mentality that's been put in our brain. I can't see no changes. Why do you think I'm hustling? Because I'm done with all the suffering. You see, I'm trying to put my ends on, trying to put my friends on, trying to give it all back. Now tell me if I'm dead wrong. Heard them say that I preach too much. What do you expect, blood? I seen too much. Man don't know where I've been too tough. Man just assume and pre too much. Ambition, don't question my talent, my passion, my vision. Mummy's life, I'm on a mission, following my intuition. And now my phone's pinging. That's a message from prison. That's a message from Jimmy. Walk one fam, long time, been a sex since you've been in. I'ma send you this skrilling, and we soon start living for real. Free all my G's in the system for real. Free all my brothers, all my childhood brothers, my family, man. Let's get out of this system, out of this cycle. It's in policies. And according to them, if you're a Muslim, you're a terrorist. Like to be stopped and searched if you... You're more likely to be stopped and searched if you got more melanin in your blood. In 2015. And they say ignorance is bliss, but ignorance exists and ignorance is real. Voice of the future. Young Martin Luther. March with me. Freedom style of speech. Have your say. Thank you everyone, man. It's been a pleasure. Hey Nizzy, you can follow me on anything, Twitter, Facebook, everything, website. Thank you.
His name's A. Nizzy, and don't you forget it. James is the Director of Africana Studies and Associate Professor of English at Lehigh University. He is the author of a book about hip-hop underground and African American culture. He's written numerous newspapers, written for numerous newspapers, including The Guardian, and he is currently an MSNBC expert contributor on race, politics, and popular culture. He's currently composing a hip-hop curriculum entitled The Fifth Element of Knowledge, which takes the 4 elements of hip-hop culture and maps them against different learning styles and standards. Amazing. Anyway, without further ado, I give to you Professor James Braxton Peterson.
Am I good right here? Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I am so excited to be here. And I want to thank all the organizers. I need one of those T-shirts, though. Somebody's gonna have to give me one of those T-shirts. I want to thank all of the organizers, especially Zoe Trott, who went through a lot of stuff to get us here. I also want to thank my colleagues, Chris Driscoll, Monica Miller, and I know Dr. Nat Duncan's around here somewhere too. Here she is. All traveling across the pond for this momentous occasion. And it is a momentous occasion, and so I'm honored and humbled to have an opportunity across the pond for this. And it is a momentous occasion.
His name's
for Black Lives. Now somebody's gonna have to keep time here, so just let me know when we're getting close. The title of my talk this evening is A Song, a Slogan, and a Service, Dispatches from the Movement for Black Lives. A song, a slogan, and a service, dispatches from the movement for Black Lives. And my first dispatch here, and I'm going to be running through this a little bit more quickly than usual, so please bear with me. My first dispatch here is to think a little bit about how a song becomes an anthem. And I guess I better get mine. Is to think about how a song becomes an anthem. And how many people here listen to Kendrick Lamar? All right, a few people do. Kendrick Lamar has a song called All Right. It's track 6 or 7. Yeah, see, she knows what I'm talking about. It's track 6 or 7 on the album To Pimp a Butterfly. And for those of you who have been following the movement in the United States, you will know that All Right has become an anthem for the Black Lives Matter movement. And what I mean by that is when people are organizing in the streets, when they're under duress from police, when they're rallying together and thinking together and trying to galvanize each other, Kendrick Lamar's All Right has been an anthem that they have sang and performed, sometimes in direct response to law enforcement brutality, but also many times just to galvanize the movement itself. I had the privilege of seeing Kendrick Lamar in DC last week when he performed with the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington, DC in the US. And it was amazing because he did his full set and he left the stage without doing All Right. And people were outraged. Even though you know an artist is going to come back after an encore, they were absolutely outraged that he hadn't performed it, and he came and performed it as his last song, showcasing just how powerful this particular song. But I want to think for a few minutes in this dispatch about how a song becomes an anthem for a movement. There's a great scholar by the name of Shauna Redman. My clicker is not working. We won't mind the technology so much. This thing where it says a song becomes an anthem is where I'm taking a quote from a scholar out of the U.S. named Shauna Redman, who studies how songs become anthems. And what she says is that for people of African descent, music constitutes a unique domain of expression. Right? For people of African descent, music constitutes a unique domain of expression. From traditional West African drumming to South African Kwaito, from spirituals to hip hop, Black life and history has been dynamically displayed and contested. Thank you very much. Yeah. Dynamically displayed and contested. Now you guys have seen the whole presentation. Displayed and contested through sound. Right? And I would argue that this is the process that's happening with All Right and the movement for Black Lives, or the Black Lives Matter movement. But I want to break it down a little bit and give you a sense of exactly how this process is occurring for you. How is it occurring for this particular song in this moment, for this movement, and for the folks who love the song and are deploying it as an anthem? One of the opening lines for the hook for the song, you hear Kendrick Lamar say, Nazareth, excuse my language, but I'm fucked up, homie, you fucked up. But if God got us, then we gonna be all right, right? And I wanna draw your attention to Nazareth, right? Because there are not a lot of rappers either here or in the US who allude specifically to certain Christian themes. And Nazareth has such a rich etymological tradition for us to think about, in the sense that, you know, we all know where Nazareth is sort of the birthplace of the Messiah, but it also has certain meanings that derive out of its biblical context about prophecy, about representing tribes that have been exiled from their communities. And for Kendrick Lamar, I think he's using it to sort of capture all of those meanings, right? To think about an urban environment out of which most people expected nothing to come, actually producing great things and great folks, right? Hip hop is that, if you think about the roots of hip hop culture. So he starts off there with that term Nazareth, right? But Nazareth also has an etymology or has a word sort of history with meanings like to watch and to keep guard, to be vigilant, and again, to acknowledge those folks who have been exiled from their community. And so I think that the Christian themes in All Right, if God got us, right, are one of the ways in which it has become an anthem in the movement for Black lives. You might also be familiar with the line from the song where he says, and we hate po-po. They want to kill us dead in the street for sure. So she knows all the words, right? We hate po-po, right? They want to kill us dead in the streets for sure. Now, this album came out earlier this year. And I can remember when the album was released and the song All Right came out. It was a really powerful song. I thought it was one of the strongest songs on the record. And when I first heard that line, we hate po-po, they want to kill us dead in the street for sure, my initial response to it was to think back historically, right? And I took that all the way back to Rodney King. I mean, initially I was thinking about like Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, but I took it back to Rodney King because when Rodney King passed away a few years ago, it was a really troublesome moment for me as a writer and as a commentator. Some of you in here are too young to remember the Rodney King piece, but the Rodney King video, being when he was brutally beaten down by LA law enforcement, was really the first viral video in this entirely long and tragic series of viral videos that we've seen. But it's striking because the Rodney King video went viral without social media. Right, the Rodney King video was shot on VHS tape. Do you guys know what VHS tape is? You look kind of young in the front here. Like the person who shot that tape had a camera on his shoulder, right? He wasn't using a phone camera, right? Right. But that video went viral when we were young, and they did. That's the moment, right? That's the moment. And so when Rodney King passed away, I wrote a piece about his life for the Daily Beast, and I opened that piece by saying, death is the new black. And the reason why I wanted to frame it that way is because when he died, one of the things that people didn't really take note of was the fact that Rodney King actually passed away because he succumbed to the injuries that he sustained in that beating. So although he died years later, right, we disconnected his death from the actual experience with police brutality that he endured in the early 1990s. And so I at that moment, I was sort of thinking about the ways in which Black death seemed to be weighing not just on me, but on the sort of world in which we live. And so when we think about Rodney King and that disconnect, I was thinking historically, we hate Po. They want to kill us dead in the street for sure. I was thinking historically. I was thinking about folks like Mike Brown. But then a week after the song comes out, right, Walter Scott in South Carolina is shot dead in the street. Now, for those of you who are following that story, you might remember that the story originates with the law enforcement officer who murdered Walter Scott says, hey, I tried to pull him over, right? There was a scuffle, right? There was a struggle. He reached for my gun. I feared for my life, and then I killed him, right? Now, for those of us who have been following and a part of this movement, when we first heard that, we're like, wait a second. That sounds familiar, right? That sounds just like the story that Darren Wilson had for Michael Brown. Right. Now, remember, this is the story before the civilian video was released. A couple of days after that civilian video is released, the lawyer for the law enforcement guy quits abruptly, right? Because now the story is completely invalid. If you watch that video, Walter Scott is shot in his back as he's running away from the law officer, right? We hate Po. They want to kill us dead in the street for sure. But the moment that the anthem went from being something that challenged me to look back at history to looking at something happening in the future, the moment that it became prophetic, right, it instantiated itself more powerfully as an anthem. It's one thing for me to say, well, I'm looking back from All Right and thinking about Michael Brown or thinking about Rodney King as the sort of point of origin for this video moment. But the moment that then Walter Scott is shot, I have to understand it as a prophetic piece as well. And the fact that it can function as both prophecy and history is yet another reason why it became an anthem. There's so many other reasons why I'm going to move along to the last piece here so I can get my other dispatches in before this is all over. Before he even starts to rap, Kendrick Lamar says, all's my life I has to fight. Right? He says, all's my life I has to fight. And let me just be clear here. You don't have to be a literary scholar. You don't have to have read The Color Purple. You don't even have to know who Oprah Winfrey is to appreciate the song All Right. But it is important to note that he is quoting Alice Walker in those lines. All's my life I has to fight. Right? And it's important to note how and why he's making this quotation. What we have here is an image of Oprah Winfrey playing the character of Sophia in Alice Walker's classic, The Color Purple. And this is a moment where she is confronting the main character, Celie, in a field. And what's happened is Celie is played by Whoopi Goldberg, right? And what has happened is that Oprah's character, Sophia, is married to a relative of Celie, a guy by the name of Harpo. And for those of you familiar with Oprah Winfrey, you'll know that her multi-million-dollar production company is called Harpo Productions, right? Now, Sophia is a character within the world of The Color Purple who is always engaged in resisting oppression. She resists white supremacy and she resists the kind of male dominance and male oppression about which The Color Purple really captures from that moment in American history. And so when Harpo is having problems with Sophia, he goes to Celie and he says, what am I supposed to do with this woman? She's unruly. I can't control her. She doesn't listen. For those of you who read Bitch Planet, she is non-compliant, right? She's non-compliant. And what Celie says to Harpo is, he says, beat her, right? He says, beat her. So Harpo goes to Sophia, they get into an argument, and he tries to beat her, right? He tries to beat her and ends up getting his ass beat. He does. Sophia beats him up, but then she goes directly to Celie right? And she says, all my life I has to fight. I've been fighting this kind of oppression. This is male oppression of women all my life. How dare you tell him to beat me? Right? So what is Kendrick Lamar doing quoting Alice Walker at the onset of this anthem, All Right? Right? He's challenging us to think about a number of different things. But what I would argue is he's changing subject positions, which is he's a male rapper taking on a quote from a woman character in one of the most classic pieces of African-American literature to show us and to demonstrate for us the value and the power of intersectionality in this movement. The value of the power of understanding that this is a movement that requires both anti-racism and womanism and feminism at the same time. At the same time. All's my life I has to fight. So these are just some of the reasons and the ways in which Kendrick Lamar is All Right. How am I doing on time? Kendrick Lamar's All Right has become an anthem. 10? I'm going on now. They're not gonna let me go. They're not gonna let me go on all night. Right? They're not gonna let me go on all night. But I want to talk a little bit about excellent. I want to talk a little bit about how that intersectionality that helped to make All Right become an anthem really is a model for how we have to continue to prosecute this movement for Black lives. And one of the sort of key examples of this is the Say Her Name hashtag, slogan, thesis of the movement within the movement. The idea that we have to centralize women's voices and women's challenges within the systems of patriarchal and racist oppression in order for this movement to make the progress that it needs to make. And the reason why I've been going around all over the US and now here in the UK to say that is because sometimes that gets lost in the movement of Black lives. Sometimes it gets lost that the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement are all women of color. Sometimes it gets lost that women are subject to sometimes unique forms of oppression within systems of patriarchy and racism, sexism, and classism. And so the movement within the movement is one way for us to think about and acknowledge how intersectionality is a centerpiece for the movement for Black lives. Now, this hashtag has proliferated, and I'm going to give you a couple of cases of how powerful it is and what it's been able to do. But first, I want to read a quote from the African American Policy Forum, which is led by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's an amazing scholar and lawyer. And what she says is, although Black women are routinely killed, raped, and beaten by the police, their experiences are rarely foregrounded in popular understandings of police brutality. Yet inclusion of Black women's experiences in social movements, media narratives, and policy demands around policing and police brutality is critical to effectively combating racialized state violence for Black communities and other communities of color. That's Kim Crenshaw from the African American Policy Forum. And I just want to tell you a couple of stories of names that you have heard because of people embracing that ethos, because of people embracing the hashtag and the theme, Say Her Name, the movement within the movement. And if we back up here to the beginning, I'm not going to show this video, but I just want to tell you a little bit about a couple of these names. You can see here in your far right bottom, that's the full-length video of Natasha McKenna and her last encounter with law enforcement. And I don't know how many of you have seen this video, and I have to be honest with you, like one of the challenges of doing this work is to really think about how often and how many times we're supposed to see these videos. How often or how many times should we share these videos? And for Natasha McKenna, I've opted to not show it. You can see it on your own if you want to, but I will tell you that we know Natasha McKenna's name because of the Say Her Name movement, because of the movement within the Black Lives Matter movement, because of the folks who are deeply invested in that intersectional moment and its potential to advance the movement in very progressive ways. If any of you have ever heard of Natasha McKenna, you can credit Say Her Name and the movement within the movement for bringing that to our attention. And I would argue that this is a very, very important piece of what the Black Lives Matter movement is doing and what it has to continue to do. But Natasha McKenna was a woman who had a diagnosed psychological challenge. And in this full-length video, what you will see if you care to or dare to watch it is you'll see 6, maybe 7 law enforcement officers in full-body hazmat suits trying to subdue her, right? She is completely naked. Right? And they are using tasers almost like a cattle prod to make her compliant. Now, the idea that this was her last encounter with anyone in her life is troubling. But if you think about how the video performs the ways in which law enforcement dehumanizes people, and the very particular way in which they dehumanize poor people and poor women and women of color, it is absolutely striking to think about it in that context. But again, what's more striking for me is that we would not know who she is. We may not know her name without this movement within the movement, right? You know, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. That's a quote from Zero Neale Hurston. And it reminds me of Sandra Bland, right? How many folks have heard of Sandra Bland? Right? We know Sandra Bland's name because of this movement within the movement, right? We know who she is because there are people who are dedicated to making sure that we access this intersectional moment. But I go to Zero Neale Hurston here, another literary reference, because this is a video you actually can watch, right? Well, let me say at the outset, I do not believe that Sandra Bland hanged herself in a cell in Texas. I don't believe it. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do not believe that Sandra Bland hanged herself in a jail cell in Texas. And I think the proof of the fact that she did is in her video. Because if you watch her video of her encounter with law enforcement when they pull her over, right, she's calling cops pussy. She's like, I'm not putting out my cigarette, right? Right? She's doing everything, and again, excuse my language, she's doing everything that Black folks in America are taught not to do when they encounter law enforcement. She's doing everything that Black people are taught not to do when they encounter law enforcement. She is rebellious. She is another Sophia in the tradition of Alice Walker's Color Purple. Right? And she's not silent at all, right? Because as Hurston says here, if you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. I do not believe that Sandra Bland committed suicide in a jail cell in Texas. But I honor the Say Her Name movement, the movement within the movement, for making sure that we know her story, for making sure that we understand what is going on and what's at stake. Without the collection of these narratives, we don't have a movement. My computer keeps freezing me out. It's working for the cops here, so. Somehow. So that's my second dispatch. I could go on, but I just need for folks to understand that we need to embrace this intersectional moment, and I'll give you my last dispatch here, and I will get off this stage. There's an essay on the African American Policy Forum piece. It's called The Charleston Imperative. And I'm going to read an excerpt from it and then kind of give you a sense of how this last dispatch works. Excuse me. And this is referring to the massacre that took place at Emmanuel AME this past summer. If the reaction to the Charleston massacre is to be realized as something beyond a singular moment of redemptive mourning, then neither the intersectional dynamics of racism and patriarchy which produced this hateful crime, and let me just say what this person is speaking about here. You know, the person who murdered those parishioners, those worshipers at Emmanuel AME, they were literally at Bible study, right? When he went on a tirade as he was shooting them in the church. And his tirade was about Black men taking white women and Black people taking over the world and things of that nature. So when African American Policy Forum here is saying, then neither the intersectional dynamics of racism and patriarchy, which produced this hateful crime, nor the inept rhetorical politics that sustain the separation of feminism from anti-racism can be allowed to continue. We can no longer allow the separation of anti-racism and feminism to continue, right? And for the author of the Charleston Imperative, the Charleston Massacre is precisely an example of this. And what I would like to think about here for a moment is how we sort of figure out how that's applicable in a particular situation. And I'm going to end with an anecdote to show you how I think we might be able to think more communally around some of these tragic instances. By the way, as soon as I get a few minutes, I'm going to add Spring Valley video to this. I don't know if you guys saw the Spring Valley High School video in South Carolina, but a law enforcement officer felt as if the only way for him to get a young Black woman, a young Black girl, a child, right, out of her chair was to brutally throw her around and drag her around the classroom, right? But the Charleston moment was one that was really, really debilitating for me, because I remember where I was. I remember exactly what I was doing. And as someone who covers these stories, when the massacre started to break on the news, it's breaking for me on social media. And as I'm seeing these things unfold, my first impulse is I really wanted to go to Charleston. I really love South Carolina. It's a beautiful state. I've spent quite a bit of time there over the years. But I couldn't go when the actual event happened, but I was able to get there about 6 weeks later. And so my family and I went to go worship at Emmanuel AME Church about 6 weeks after the massacre occurred. And the church is beautiful. It is a beautiful church, and it's beautiful because of its aesthetics and its architectural structures, but it's also a beautiful and really sacred space because of the history of that church, right? This is a church that's been burned down for being a church engaged in resistance efforts. It's a church that's been terrorized before, right? And so we enter into the sanctuary, and unfortunately, we chose a Sunday where the governor of South Carolina happened to be visiting the church as well. So there actually were law enforcement officers there armed with guns, which always makes me a little bit nervous. But we entered into the sanctuary, and I'm trying to just sort of absorb it and kind of take it all in. And there's this process that the congregation and the pastor kind of have to go through at this point in time, because they're accepting so many visitors. There's so many visitors that are coming in to try to pay tribute and try to be in solidarity with them. And there were basically three types of tributes. And you can imagine that because they're having all these visitors, these tributes take up a lot of time. And so this process must have lasted almost an hour before you could even start the church process, the church service. And so there's three types of tributes that people were making. The first type, which is the type I thought was the best, were people who sent letters into the church expressing their solidarity. And the pastor would read a bit of the letter, say this is from so-and-so, share with the community. I remember that Sunday that we were there, Hootie and the Blowfish had sent them a check for $50,000 for their music ministry. Everyone's like, yay. Who knew Hootie and the Blowfish? Who knew, right? The second type of tribute that people were making were people in large groups. So there were parts of different church congregations that were there. There were parts of choirs that were there, and they would stand up really quickly. 30, 40 people would stand up. One person would speak for them. They would express their solidarity, explain where they're from, so on and so forth, and then kind of keep it moving. There was a group of three young women there who performed an incredible song, but they truncated the song and dedicated it to the folks that were there. But then there's a third type of tribute. And this tribute was a series of individuals who would go up one at a time. And unlike the groups, so the groups would stand up where they were, right? The individuals came to the front and stood at the pulpit. And believe it or not, the individuals took the most amount of time, right? They talked the longest, right? And they were going on and on about how they couldn't believe that this had happened, which to me is just BS, you know what I mean? But they would also, explain how they cried when they heard about it, and really talk about their sort of emotional feelings and their affective response to hearing about this awful tragedy. Some of them like made different like arts and crafts kinds of things that they would donate. And as the individuals were coming up and doing their thing, I'm like looking at my kids like, because I'm getting really annoyed. I'm getting really, really annoyed. I'm looking at my kids like, yo, do you guys see what I'm seeing here? Right? That the groups are getting up, moving fast, being in solidarity, thinking about community. Individuals are up there talking about their own personal response. And the blood is still in the rug. The blood is still in that rug. Do you understand what it means for you as an individual to come into this space and talk to the people who have survived this massacre about how you feel? The people in that church are still mourning their losses of their pastors, their grandmothers, their aunts, their uncles. The blood is still in the rug. That's not an exaggeration. Right? How in the world can you as an individual come up and feel like the articulation of your experience with this massacre somehow should absorb the time of the community's experience with it? So that really is, for me, what taught me why this intersectional moment is so important, right? Because it's not just about the intersections of race and gender, although that's vital, right? The intersection of the feminist movement and the anti-racism movement, right? Two movements that have been around for a while, but often find great difficulties in working in collaboration with each other. But it's also about individuals understanding that this movement is not about you, right? It's not about me, right? You can't stand in Emmanuel AME and talk about your personal feelings to the people, I have 3 minutes, to the people, right, who are still wrestling with all of those issues. And so the intersectional moment then, to me, becomes the predicate without which the movement cannot make progress, right? If individuals can't make sacrifices for the community, right? And if leaders of movements across the sort of anti-racism and feminist spectrum cannot work together, the movement will not be able to sustain itself. And there are very clear indicators, right? Very clear indicators when we're operating in these intersectional moments, right? You will know that you are being intersectional because, one, you'll see that in the people in the room. You'll understand that in who's speaking and why and for whom and from what platform and on behalf of whom someone is speaking. You will hear it in the themes and the content of intersectionality, which is trying to embrace a series of issues and platforms, right, to bring them together in a quilt-like fashion, right, so that we can achieve the greatest purpose of this movement, right? Achieve the greatest purpose of this movement. Obviously, this movement is about wrestling with and defeating and rooting out state-sanctioned violence. But at the root of that is patriarchy, racism, sexism, classism. And unless we understand how those things work, how oppressions work, oppressions and oppressive systems are intersectional. And this is why at the end of the day, the only way that the movement for Black lives will be successful is if we embrace that intersectionality ourselves and understand that the higher purpose and the greater goals to be achieved through intersectionality is what this movement has been about from the very beginning. Thank you.
Where you're from. In Nottingham, we call it a whip round. We had a whip round for you. We got your t-shirt. If you don't ask, you don't get. Now, don't come all asking me for a t-shirt because you ain't gonna get it. Don't work like that. Okay, just while we're getting ready for Christmas to come on, just to let you know that the hashtag for the October Dialogues is hashtag Black Lives Matter UK. We have been trending throughout the day at 6th in the UK. So people throughout the UK have been talking about this event. Please use it in your tweets. when you're tweeting about the speakers, when you're tweeting about Akala, when you're tweeting about our next guest. Now, our next guest, otherwise known as Wonder Woman. I met her because she came to work for Bright Ideas. Was it about 2 years ago now? 18 months ago. So she came to work at Bright Ideas, and she's just amazing. And, she's always telling me, I've learned so much at Bright Ideas, and, my learning's gone like that. But actually, I've learned so much from this young woman. She's just been incredible. I think of her as my daughter. Some people might say, we shouldn't cross those intersections of professionalism and personal lives. But, she's like my daughter. But, there is another side to her, which also is amazing. And she is the artist called Chris Riss, which many of you will know. So in December last year, just to recap what we talked about earlier, we had a protest in Nottingham. It was called I Can't Breathe Nottingham. And it was against the senseless loss of black lives at the hands of police brutality, not just in the US, but here in the UK, most importantly here in the UK. And that will come across in the lyrics that you're going to hear next. So just to repeat again what I said this morning, 3 artists from Nottingham were tasked with the really tall order of coming up with a protest track to order. If you don't ask, you don't get. So the protest was on the 21st of December last year. It was the busiest shopping day in the year, just that 3 days before Christmas. And these guys had about 3 days to write a protest track for the Nottingham I Can't Breathe sort of movement. Less, yeah, it turned out more like 48 hours. Chris Riss, Two-Tone and Jadiga went away with the producer, is it Amala? They went away, and the first night they went away and they came back with nothing, and, we weren't panicking because we knew they could do it, but the second day they went away, so this is the Thursday before the Saturday, they went away, and the text started coming through saying, yeah, it's coming together, the next piece is coming together. And on the Friday, which was the day before the protest, we heard the track for the first time. So I'm going to hand you over to Chris Riss. She's going to just tell you a little bit more about the context, and then we're going to have a look at the music video, which was also produced as part of the Nottingham protest. Give her a big love. Chris Riss.
Hi everyone again. Back as Chris Riss this time. Yeah, so I'm an artist from Nottingham, do music, and we have this tune which we produced called I Can't Breathe. It was about the Eric Garner situation. He kept saying I can't breathe. He said it about 11 times and they still killed him. My boss Lisa, as when I'm Marissa, she showed us this video and we was like, wow, like we're gonna make a tune. So I got together with 2 other guys. We were originally supposed to perform it together, but one of them's broke his ankle. So we're just gonna make do and we're gonna get through. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna do the verse and we're gonna play the video. So I hope you enjoy it. So, see, feds wanna target the black race. You get, nah. Too fast. Okay, see, the feds want to target the black race. You get run down for your black face. Government don't care about you. See, nor do they care about I. Black boys, they don't want to see you alive. And black girls, they don't want you stand by the side. The pigs don't get locked for no homicide. When they're going to draw the line, think of Mike. I can't breathe. That was his plead. See, they left him lying in the street. Yo, they left him dying over peace. I got brothers, Walipa cousins, uncles, nephews, plenty of others. See, what about Mark Duggan? What about Tamia Rice? Coming like they never valued their life. I can't breathe. Don't shoot. I can't breathe. Don't shoot. I can't breathe. Don't shoot. Last words from an innocent youth. Hit it. I can't breathe. Feds wanna target the black race. Get gone down for your black face. Government they care about you, nor do they care about I. Black boys, they don't wanna see you alive, and black girls, they don't want you stand by the side. The pigs don't get locked for no homicide. When they're gonna draw the line, think of Mike. I can't breathe, that was his plead. Left him lying in the streets, left him dying of a piece. I got brothers, one heap of cousins, uncles, nephews, plenty of others. What about Mark Duggan? What about Tamir Rice? Coming like they never valued their life.
I can't breathe, don't shoot. 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 I can't breathe, don't shoot.
Last words from an innocent youth.
I can't breathe, don't shoot. 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 I can't breathe, don't shoot.
R.I.P. Last words from an innocent youth.
I question your intellect. If you think my skin's a threat, you pedophiles don't get 5 to 10 and we're getting killed over cigarettes. It's so sad. So sad. You see, black power's my dad, and white Wilshire's my mum. How you gonna kill a man with no gun? If I put my hands up, it's no stun. Rest in peace to Mark Duggan. The system's still corrupt. White suits are in closets. The uniforms are changed up. New reform, they blame us. What black man do you know with a chopper? Tell me who's importing this stuff. Last night's crime scene, that was a horror. But I ain't holding no grudge. I wanna see unity in my borough. It's time my people woke up. When a black kid kills a black kid, don't you know we get double life? Can I live till I'm 25? Can my offspring have a better ride? You know, like a hot spring when a genocide. Why? They gotta go that far. But when cops kill, who police the law? My black life matters just as much as yours.
I can't breathe, don't shoot. 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 I can't breathe, don't shoot.
Last words from an innocent youth.
I can't breathe, don't shoot. 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 I can't breathe, don't shoot.
R.I.P. Last words from an innocent youth.
I can't breathe. Officer, loosen your squeeze. Here, take all the fags that you want in my life, it's more precious to me. If you're gonna kill one, you gotta kill us all. Stand together, we're gonna build a wall. Survival tactics, we're built for war. I don't like their tactics, they're ill for sure. And that was lame what they did to Eric. That was lame what they did to Mark. I feel pain when I spit my bars. The racism ain't as blatant as it was before. Trust me, so much foul injustice. The system is a dustbin. They walk from stone cold murder, then play victim. That's disgusting. And we can walk with 1,000,000 man, but is it gonna make a change if it makes you a wait? Let's step then. Samuel, tell him again, if it's foul at the top, somebody gotta step down. Injuries, the lynching is abroad. They think of us as like bottom of the list. They think of us as like no minority. They think of us as like we're minority. I can't breathe, don't shoot. 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 I can't breathe, don't shoot.
Last words from an innocent youth.
I can't breathe, don't shoot. 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 I can't breathe, don't shoot.
R.I.P. Last words from an innocent youth. Last words from an innocent youth. Thank you, thank you. So now we're going to introduce our next guest. She is amazing. By reading the bio, she sounds like, I got to talk to her after. So yeah, her name is Professor Monica Miller, Assistant Professor of Religion and Africana Studies and Director of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies at Lehigh University, and the author of several books about religion, hip-hop, and race. She is also co-chair and founder of Critical Approaches of the Study of Hip-Hop and Religion Group, and the guest lecturer at colleges, universities, conferences throughout the US, Cuba, Europe, and Canada. Give a big round of applause for Monica Miller.
Thank you, thank you. It's such an honor. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm so honored to be here thinking about the transatlantic connections and conversations and dialogues, and now we're in the thick of hip hop and still talking about breath and still talking about bodies. I want to thank you all so much for being here. and she probably will be a little bit upset with me, but I want Dr. Zoe Trod to stand up. Woo! Who has worked incredibly hard to make all of this possible, and the work, obviously, along with her colleagues, and the work that is also happening as an academic, as a scholar who doesn't get in the street quite often. So my street is often the sonic flow of hip hop, but talking to people on corners, and also having a rich opportunity at Lehigh University to be in a department, religion studies, to be in a program, Africana studies, my colleague, Dr. James Peterson, my partner here, Dr. Christopher Driscoll, my colleague, friend, Dr. Natanya Duncan, where hip hop lives. And so I'm really excited that the energy and the flow and the vibe of hip hop is here tonight. So thank you all so much to all of the collaborators, the community partners, this space that we're in, where art and the mind meet together. And so I'm really excited to talk with you all a little bit about Nowhere to Go, hip hop, Black life, and flowing in a post-everything moment. And I want to put out there this idea of flow, because we've been flowing all day, and we've just had some beautiful artistic creativity that has flowed. Dr. Peterson's talk, we are flowing and thinking with historical figures, movements, ideas. Dr. Zoe Trod started this conference off today with a flow, with a historical, intellectual genealogy, right? We've got Frederick Douglass, we've moved through Black Power, we moved through global movements for human rights, and here we are now talking about hip hop, and I am absolutely excited to do so. What I want to think with you all about is I want to think about the philosophy of Black Lives Matter, and I'm thinking about this within a hip hop cosmology. So Kendrick, right? And all of those other artists, and J. Cole, and all of that energy that is on the front lines. And what I want you all to think about is the civil rights movement and Black Power. And today we've had so much conversation about where have we been, where are we now, and where are we going, right? And so a bit of our conversation has been situated between this idea of movement, right? Is this a moment or a movement? And I think that hip hop culture, as a vital usable past, to use Professor Trod's work and rhetoric to talk about what it is that we trope from the past, I think hip hop provides a flow that allows us to keep complexity and contradiction in tension. And before I get on with my talk, what I'm trying to do here with Nowhere to Go is to think about, what do we do? One of the participants today talked about, I don't really know what Black Lives Matter is, right? This is a US kind of movement, a US movement, a moment that has had global import. But what do we do? And where do we go? And we've had so many ideas about what we could do. Do we need more Black cops? Do we need more policy? Do we need more community oversight about our own protection? And we ended the conference thinking about imagination. Maybe it is imagination where it is that we need to go. And this is what I want to call the double bind. And it is the double bind of the transatlantic divide, which again, this conference has so brilliantly brought together, that the transatlantic, right, in the ways in which it crisscrosses, is here in this moment. And I'm very grateful for all of you in the room. So while we know where to go, there still is nowhere to go. And I want to think about hip hop, Black life, and flowing in a post-everything movement. And I want to begin with James Baldwin, and I didn't copy the launch event last night, which was brilliant, where young people are talking about these ideas of resistance, liberation, freedom, right? Talking about Nation of Islam, the 5% concepts. I want to think about the philosophy that is grounding the conversations that we've had today. And I had planned to start off with Baldwin And it was amazing because last night we began with Baldwin's Nigger. And I want to talk a little bit about distance. So let's begin with this quote from James Baldwin, that brilliant humanist, intellectual, civil rights advocate who had nowhere to go. And so he used the transatlantic moment or movement to move his body to a place where he had to get distance from home, a geographic distance from home, in order to reflect on home. And we'll see at the end of this presentation how he reflects on home. And he does it by giving back a particular thing to the American landscape. One can measure very neatly the white American's distance from his conscience, from himself, by observing the distance between white America and Black America. And there we can add not only the antagonism, the binary between white America and Black America, we can add Black Americans, Americanness, the managing of Muslim difference, right? The illegibility of trans folk, LGBTQ folk, and we could go on and on. But we're talking about distances, and not only the geographic distance, but the ideological difference. So one has only to ask oneself, who established this distance? Who is this distance designed to protect? And from what is this distance designed to offer protection? And so I'm excited to talk about hip hop. And I think that hip hop offers a certain kind of usable pass, right? We've been thinking about, is Black Lives Matter Black Power? Is it part of the civil rights movement? What about hip hop culture is a usable pass, is a contemporary moment, and is a movement? And when we say movement, what do we mean by movement? Something that is going to literally untether the system from itself? Can we get outside of the system? Do we ultimately have nowhere to go? Is it policy? Is it the Hill? Is it a Black president? Is it keeping it real? Where are we going to go? And we know for Baldwin, he went to France. He said, let me get some distance from home in order to reflect on home. But what hip hop has done is that they've created a digital and a sonic diaspora. You don't have to leave home to be a part of the diaspora, right? You just have to have a certain kind of faith in the flow. And so what about hip hop? Might we consider might have some utility for this usable pass? And so I want to think with you all, and this has been a constant term that we've used today, moment or movement. Moment has a temporality to it. Movement gives the assumption that something is happening, an event, a moment, a movement. But I want to think about movement in a different kind of way. I don't necessarily want to reify binary thinking, right? A certain kind of bifurcation of thought. We had civil rights, we had Black power, those were movements. What happens? What happens in the break? What happens with the fragmentation? Hip hop is a movement that has global flows. And here I talk about that kind of movement as a certain kind of apparatic flow. A movement that is queer, that is fluid, that is complex, one that has a particular kind of imagination. It is a usable pass that provides not easy and tidy resolutions and answers. I'm not interested in easy answers to the problem. I don't think more Black police officers on the force will help. I don't necessarily think that a Black president in the White House will help. He's done incredible things, and I have some issues with some other things, as I do with many hip hop artists, right? But critique is a part of the process, right? Heritage lives only if we can critique that heritage and recast it so that it can relive in new historical moments. And so this usable pass is a productive conceptual moment for us to think about how we archive roots and routes, how we think about the desire to be. And so that is what I want to think with you all about. What is a movement? Should this be a movement or a moment? Or should this be a movement where we are literally moving, transgressing borders and boundaries and sexualities and religion? Do we know where to go, or do we have nowhere to go? Let's see. And so this is really the slide that I want to think about, establishing the problem with movement, right? We're talking about the movement of bodies across a certain kind of divide, the transatlantic, right? And here we are in this room, and both sides and multiple sides of the Atlantic have come together. And so I want to think with you all about distance. Now, where's my Baldwin here? Let's see. All right. So I want to look forward, and I also want to look back. We've been playing with this notion of the past and the present. And for me, the past is always present. But if we tie ourselves too closely to the past, there is no present, and there is no movement in the present. So let me say something that's probably a little politically incorrect, a little irreverent, if you will. I don't know actually, let me just be crass for a moment. I don't think Black Lives Matter as a movement is I don't want to call it a new Black Power movement. I don't want to call it the Civil Rights Movement. I think that it is movement within and that stands upon those movements of the past, and that it's doing something radically different. And what it's doing is it's looking forward, and it's also got this moment of looking backward. So the past is not unimportant, but the critique of the past and using the parts that are effective and productive and generative of the past are important. So here we have Nicki Minaj, right? And I'm not going to stay on this too long. We might have some Q&A about it and what this means. But I want to think about our preoccupation with this notion of the movement working backward. We heard a lot of Malcolm today. We didn't hear about Nicki Minaj, though. So I think that Nicki is representative of a certain kind of moving forward. So what is there about those who rely on this notion of history? Too much. Too much. So much so that we become here in this moment equally doomed to repeat the past in a way where we don't know where to go. It was mentioned today in the conference in one of the presentations, Bayard Rustin's name was invoked, and I was very happy for that, right? We say the civil rights movement, but whose civil rights movement? We talk about violence, but whose violence are we talking about? Violence or whose violence? We talk about a civil rights movement, right? But we're not always thinking with James Baldwin, and we're certainly not always thinking with someone like Bayard Rustin. Now, let me get just, I don't want everyone responding, but let me get just a little interactive. And as our panelists mentioned this afternoon, why isn't Rustin mentioned? We know MLK, right? Does anyone remember? That's exactly right. And so that race and sexuality were these two ideas that had to be separate. And in fact, we had a difficult conversation last night in the launch, right? With a particular comment that gave an assumption that if you separate race and gender and sexuality, that now you are considered a divided house, and that a movement cannot have a divided house. But this is why we're still asking, do Black Lives Matter? Right? So what Nicki Minaj is doing with Looking Ass Niggas is providing a moment to think about how we move into a moment. Black Lives Matter, right? Professor Trod started off the day reminding us that this is a moment of a movement which represents movement around gender, movement around sexuality. It is queer. It is women. It is women of color, right? And religion is not foregrounded. I'm using the idea of faith in the flow, but the Black church is no longer the center. And I think that this is a productive moment, a very interesting space to think about what is it that tethers it together. And for me, it's Black bodies. Black bodies as the site of significance. Not Malcolm, not the civil rights moment, but Black bodies and the unending Black death. That Black death which proliferates, not just in the US, but also all over the world. And so I think it's important for us to think about how we're navigating distance, how we're thinking about the usable past, how we're measuring the contemporary moment over and against that usable past, and what are the strategies and tactics that we have cultivated of knowing where to go. And I think this is where hip hop provides a moment to think about that, right? Think of some of the popular hip hop strategies. Keep it real, right? Life is kind of a hustle. It's uncertain. It's shape-shifting. It's witty. It's unsuspecting. They weren't ready for Kendrick. No, right? They weren't ready for Kendrick. It's unsuspecting. So in terms of strategy, it might have a 10-point program, but it also knows that much of this needs to be coded in certain kinds of ways, right? If we think about the 5%ers as the young man was riffing on yesterday, one of the brilliant aspects of Nation of Islam and even the 5%ers, which is this esoteric kind of outgrowth, right, of the Nation of Islam, is that they spoke in code. They spoke in code during a historical moment where white supremacy said Black bodies are nobody, 3/5. And yet you had Black men on the corner in Harlem, renamed Mecca, calling each other gods. White folk didn't know what they were talking about. They said they were dropping signs on the corner, right? And we know that the politics of surveillance always bears down on Black bodies in a way to label them as pathological. So that founder, Clarence 13X, was labeled a paranoid schizophrenic, right? A Black man that thinks himself God, or a Black woman who thinks herself God, must be schizophrenic. Why? Because you're not yet fully human. How can you be a God in that moment? And so, how do we move away from problem status? How do we move away from the problem? There's so much movement, and yet there's so many problems. And the problems end up lining up like a grocery list, right? So problem status, right? How does it feel to be a problem? We're literally 112 years away, moving on from that powerful question that Du Bois raised. How does it feel to be a problem? And yet we have bodies globally, brown bodies, Muslim bodies, LGBTQ bodies, brown people that literally don't even feel like they can be. To be means one has to be. Ontology, beingness. How can you be a problem if you're not even yet fully human? And so thinking about where we're going in the past and the present, how do we move away from problem status? How do we transmute problems into creative ingenuity and skill? And this is where I think hip hop comes in. Because hip hop was unanticipated. It took what it could, right? You're poaching raw products that were dealt to you through the sleight of hand of being on the underside, right, of American democracy and of capitalism. And there are a number of ways in which we've tried to move away from problem status. The abolitionist movement, the Back to Africa movement, right? That we've heard these ideas mentioned today. The civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement, LGBTQ movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. Is it a moment or is it a movement? International movement, global movement, is it intersectional as Black Power movement, as civil rights movement? And perhaps it is both moment and movement in flow, in process, in action. I think I need some water, if that's okay. Thank you. And so we've done a lot of moving. We've talked about policy. We've talked about adding more brown faces to police force, right? And it's interesting for me and my colleagues on the other side of the Atlantic, because for us, we don't necessarily know what to do with this moment. What is this moment that we're in? Michael Brown's body lays in the street for 4 hours in the scorching sun, but yet we have a Black president. And they're both made gods. And I'm not saying God in an affirmative sense. We commemorate that body that laid in the street. But there is a peril side to sociological God status. And then yet we have this, what I would call in my own work, this new Black God in the White House, right? So we've done a lot of moving, but we still face problem status, and maybe perhaps we've bought into this strategy of using certain kinds of distances rather than refuting the distances. We should not have to make the claim that Black Lives Matter is intersectional. It automatically needs to be intersectional. For any question to be raised around the import of Black women's contributions to any type of social movement, whether it's the Black Church or Nation of Islam, Black women were known, and I mean, it's literally common sense, the backbone of the Black church. And so are queer folk. You wouldn't have Black church if you didn't have the LGBTQ contribution, right? And I'm not saying hip hop faces these problems as well, but these are the kinds of distances that are not only geographic, but are metaphorical and ideological and social in nature. So we have a lot of moving to do. And I'm not quite certain we can talk about movement, if this is a movement, if we're still raising questions such as, well, if you separate race and gender, right, then that is a house that is divided. If we're still asking that, then maybe we're still stuck in the civil rights movement, where we know patriarchy and heteronormativity and religious hegemony dominated just as much as all of the generative and other formative and affirmative political aspects. So where are we moving to, and where are we going? What kind of moment is this? How do we move away from the problem? And I want to think about this notion of being lost in the wilderness. And I think about myself. I spent a lot of time in Europe, thanks to colleagues on this side of the Atlantic, and thanks to my good friend and colleague, Dr. James Peterson, who provides these resources within our Africana Studies program in my own department of religion. And I myself feel conflicted. I come here and I'm like, oh, thank God I'm out of the US. Thank God. And yet, literally within 20 minutes, I can feel my American imagination working on me. Why are you looking at me like that? Do you see me? Wait, you don't see me. And I myself, within my own imagination, have this perplexing moment of not wanting to be seen and yet being overseen, right? And so it's this kind of being lost in the wilderness, right? Slaves called it Canaan land, right? Escaping to the north. Canaan land, the land of milk and honey, as my colleague Dr. Peterson mentioned, that biblical language and that language of the prophetic is so important, not only to Black social movements and social protests, but also for Black expressive culture, Black cultural production. And in fact, as a scholar of religion, I would go as far as to argue that without religion, without the theological vocabulary of Black Islam, Black atheism, Black humanism, and Christianity, there literally would be no way to make a way out of no way. Or as hip hop says, how the do you make $1 out of 15 cents? How do you do it? Right? In a lost interview with Tupac Shakur, he talks about, look, I turn words into money. That's creative ingenuity. That's a certain kind of transmutation, which is just as social and political as it is religious. And one of the most powerful vocabularies and grammars that I think Black Islams, not just Nation of Islam, we could go back to the Moorish Science Temple of America, we could think about the 5% concepts of Islam. And this is not to say that these were pure philosophies. They had problems. They still do. So does the Black church, right? So problem status is still there, right? But what became Canaan land for the slaves escaping to the north? For those that were participating in Black Islam, it became the wilderness of North America, which means that you wonder why you wander. There's nowhere to go. How do we orient ourselves to a particular moment or a movement? And so I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about taking stock of what this is. What is Black Lives Matter a moment or a movement, or should that movement be something that is recursive, in process, never ending? Maybe this is the question we always need to ask ourselves. And what Black Lives Matter means in the US, it will look different in the UK. 4 minutes. Oh my goodness. All right. And so you can take a look here and think about what I'm interested in talking about, though, and how do we smuggle in the problematic aspects of the past? How do we think about distances as constraints? And what might be the utility of calling Black Lives Matter as a new civil rights movement, a new Black power movement, or even using the language of a post-civil rights movement? And this is where I look to both hip hop and philosophy. I think of this moment as movement through aporia, impasse. Today I heard so much impasse and so much liminality, stuck. We have options, but they're not complete. We have moments, but without resolution. And so French philosopher Jacques Derrida says that this notion of aporia means that this could be an alternative to problem status where you don't know where to go. It's a non-passage. It's an experience of that liminality, that being in between hyperlegibility and illegibility. That which appears to kind of block us, right, and to separate us. But also to think about the hope against hope in this moment of what could it look like and what could it be if we were to think about the impasse, the interstices as a space of impossible possibility where we no longer could be constituted as a problem. And then, of course, I look to Jay-Z, who talks about if the beat is time and the flow is what we do with that time, how we live through it, then that means that the beat is everywhere, but every life has to find its own flow. I'm not going to play this. I don't have time, but I'm sure that you all have taken a look at this, but this is a powerful moment where J. Cole asks a question which is important. It's important to the prophetic. It's what we call theodicy. It's when we take the time to think about that word which was mentioned today, the hounding and the haunting. And it's that question called why. And he says, why? Every time I step outside, why do I see my niggas die? He didn't have an answer, but he's asking a question. And in this clip, he goes on to riff with and on Obama. And he has a critique. Lauryn Hill and Black Rage. We heard a lot today about pain, how we express that pain, and how that pain can cause new forms of distances. And I love Lauryn Hill, but in neurotic society, she's being transphobic. I've written about that. She wrote back to me about that, and I just disagree. But the psychic life of pain and grief, right? But that Black rage is founded upon 2/3 a person. And here we end with this notion of niggas in Paris. So we think about Baldwin escaping to France. He had to get away from home. It was suggested last night in the pre-launch event that, well, he wasn't part of the movement. He didn't keep it real. He didn't stay there to be in the movement. Actually, he needed the distance to reflect on home. And I'm going to go to that clip because I'm going to show you what Baldwin was able to do when he got distance from home to reflect on home. But this is this kind of current iteration of a Baldwin moment, right? Niggas in Paris and maybe niggas in Britain and this new diasporic exile. Jay-Z says, I'm shocked too. I'm supposed to be locked up too. Hell, if you escape, he's talking about America, if you escape what I escape, you be in Paris getting fucked up too. It's a celebration, but a celebration of the impossible. Baldwin says in 84, right, now this is after he spent some time in exile, I always knew I would have to come back. If I were 24 down, I don't know if or where I would go. I don't know if I would go to France. I might go to Africa. Europe is no longer a frame of reference, a standard bearer, the classic model. It's not the measuring stick. There are other standards in the world. When I was a kid, the world was white, and for all intents and purposes, and now it is struggling to remain white, which is a very different thing. And I will end with this clip, which is not very long. And what I want to say is that the world is no longer white, right? Think about that. I can't breathe, where you have the police officer who says, fuck your breath. The world is struggling to remain white. And after Baldwin gets the distance that his humanist and atheist and Black queer self needed, despite the politics of identity politics and authenticity, and folk were saying, you need to keep it real and stay in Harlem and be a part of the movement. And he's, fuck it, I'm going to France. And this is what he finds.
Well, I know this. Anyone who's ever tried to live knows this. So what you say about somebody else, anybody else, reveals you. What I think of you as being is dictated by my own necessities, my own psychology, my own fears and desires. I'm not describing you when I talk about you. I'm describing me. Now here in this country, we've got something called a nigger. It doesn't in such terms, I beg you to remark, exist in any other country in the world. We have invented the nigger. I didn't invent him. White people invented him. I've always known, I had to know by the time I was 17 years old. What you were describing was not me, and what you were afraid of was not me. It had to be something else. You had invented it. So it had to be something you were afraid of. And you invested me with. Now if that's so, no matter what you've done to me, I can say to you this, and I mean it. I know you can't do any more, and I've got nothing to lose. And I know, and I've always known, and really always, that's part of the agony. I've always known that I'm not a nigger. But if I am not the nigger, and if it's true that your invention reveals you, then who is the nigger? I am not the victim here. I know one thing from another. And I know I'm going to born and I'm going to be, I was born, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die. So the only way you get through life is to know the worst things about it. I know that a person is more important than anything else. Anything else. I learned this because I've had to learn it. But you still think, I gather, that the nigger is necessary. Well, he's unnecessary to me, so he must be necessary to you. I'll give you your problem back. You're the nigger, baby, it isn't me.
Thank you.
Monica, thank you.
Use that term against you. You can't really, there's no equivalent, there's no response, because I don't want people to be thinking about how you respond to hate, right? Or how you, because we don't want to get trapped in like a reactionary mode when it comes to these kinds of movements. I think what we have to understand about the N-word, especially in this moment where hip hop, people feel like hip hop allows them to say it in public spaces, right? White folks saying it in public spaces, right? To me, there's like very simple rules about the N-word, like very simple rules. Number one, white people should never say it under any circumstances whatsoever, right? Just don't say it. Just don't say it. And number two, if you're a black person using the term, you need to understand that within your private speech community, with your homies, with your family or whatever, that's one thing. But the moment it gets outside of that private speech community, the moment that it gets on a record or it's said in a classroom, then you cannot divorce it from its awful white supremacist history. I don't care how much of a term of endearment or how much you want to deconstruct it or whatever, you can still use it. I don't want to censor anybody. I'm just telling you that's how it works. Number one, white people shouldn't use it. Number two, if you think it's some kind of term of endearment, it may operate that way amongst you and your homies or about you and your private speech community or your small circle. But the moment it gets outside of that, it engenders the sort of awful history that it has.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I want to just add one thing. There's certain parts of that question that I don't want to touch, aside from saying it's painful. And it's a painful word. And when I sit down and I talk to my grandmother about it, it's a painful type of thing. And you know, just a few days ago in London, I was having this conversation with a group of graduate students at the London School of Economics, and they were mostly white. There were some students of color in the room. So just to build off of what Dr. Peterson is saying, here's the flip side of it, though. I feel like that hip hop artists in particular, there's a certain identity politic that is at work and that is at play in the question itself. It makes me uncomfortable when I get the question all the time, not by people of color, but by dominant culture folk about Kanye being too misogynistic and why does he think he's a god and did Jay-Z donate to Black Lives Matter? Because we do not, and again, the social responsibility is one thing, right? But there are a whole lot of white folk consuming hip hop as well, and there are a lot of different art forms. And I'm curious why we do not ask the same questions about other artists. Do we walk in museums and wonder why women's legs are splayed out in particular ways? And do we see that as pornotropic? Do we see that as misogynistic? I mean, you know, there are people that feel like Kanye West is too full of hubris, right? He's a god and he thinks he walks on, you know, water, but yet at the same time, he called himself a slave too, right? Like he, philosophically, we would say he's like this Black Hegel, right? He gets the dialectic, he understands kind of how it works. But I also do, you know, aside from the reality of the pain, I also do want to put out there that I think that disproportionately, I can't speak for this context, but in our context in the US, that artists of color are held to disproportionate expectations of political participation. And I don't think it's fair. Kurt Cobain was talking about raping people, and I don't see where that conversation around misogyny necessarily was. So I think it's important that we have a balanced kind of perspective. But certainly artists definitely have a social responsibility, and they'll rap in their music that they don't want to be politicians. But of course we know that hip hop, I mean, I think Dr. Peterson would agree, it's this global bridge. I think hip hop actually has been able to accomplish what no prior movement has been able to do, sonically, lyrically, physically, geographically. And so there is a commitment that comes with that. But I think that it also, that those questions need to be balanced out, and that the racialization, remember when I miscalled that group of basketball players, nappy-headed hoes. He blamed it on hip-hop, and the hip-hop, the black community took it as real, and so we had a burial for the N-word, and then we had town hall meetings on Oprah, and we started blaming hip-hop artists, right? We started blaming rappers, and while we started pathologizing our own community, Imus gets his job back.
Yeah, well, if you fancy the odds, there is always a very good response for someone racially abusing you or calling you a nigger, and that's a punch in the face. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. If it's 10-on-1, maybe you might walk away, but if you feel pain, there's nothing wrong with responding adequately to that. There's a lot of sisters these days are doing MMA. And everyone knows Ronda Rousey would take Floyd any day of the week. In fact, my Muay Thai coach is a woman, and she beats me up regularly. I would recommend the sisters take up some form of self-defense. I think anyone in any kind of remotely revolutionary movement should be practicing some form of self-defense, because it can get like that. But B, with the word nigger, and I will just say nigger because when we say N-word, that's what you're thinking anyway, right? People act as if white people only started calling black people niggers once hip-hop got popular. Right. It's very strange, and I agree that rappers are held to complete double standards, of course, and even as someone who's critical of certain strains within hip-hop, I'm still defensive in the sense that when the narrative around critiquing hip-hop comes up, no one asks who owns hip-hop, who puts hip-hop on the radio. As Mos Def said, old white men is running this rap shit. Right. Some tall Israeli is running this rap shit, and his label took the song. For those who don't know, Mos Def made a song called The Rape's Over on the same beat that Jay-Z used for The Takeover, and they took it off his album without telling him his label, and then of course he couldn't get back into the US and all kinds of other stuff. So there's certain type of performed blackness, as Baldwin talks about, a niggerized blackness that white society loves to consume and then pathologize at the same time, but it's for you. It's your version and your vision of blackness. So I think that on the other hand, though, I think Black America is in a particularly unique space in the sense that if you are a successful Black American artist, you wouldn't even be able to shit in white people's toilets if it wasn't for mass movements of black people. Yep. So you kind of do owe your community in a very black and white way that isn't really applicable to many other places in the world.
It's true.
Go ahead.
I wanted to know, first of all, maybe if our American guests can tell us, we're very well aware, as you know, what's happened in the States as far as individual Black deaths are concerned in police custody. And even our media will give us more information on what's happening to people in America than they do in England. Even if you send things to known Black journalists in England to know about, they kind of almost ignore it and will focus on what's happening in America. We need to know both sides, obviously. So I wondered if very briefly, either one of you or both of you could say what you know about how Black deaths in England, how much is known in America. That would be useful. And to Akala, maybe, I'm not sure if you've taken your performance to the States and what the response has been like, oh, so that happens in England too? It'd just be interesting to know what responses has been. Thanks.
It's difficult. One of the things that, we were noticing on the news today is that we're getting stories that we don't get told in the U.S. So part of it is just the limitation of media. But I think also the other part of the problem is precisely the work that we're doing in this room to kind of amend, right, those distinct kind of conversations. This is not uniquely an American problem that this is happening over here. But that's one of the reasons why I was talking about distances, because there is a way in which we can assume that in certain parts of the world, certain things aren't happening, right? Like as a Black woman here in various parts of UK and Europe, I feel safe. I feel safe. And I'm not saying that everyone should feel safe or that is a false sense of protection. But when I look at cops and I see the fact that they don't have guns on their hips, I'm like, phew, I can breathe. And so I do think that there needs to be a better transatlantic dialogue around what Black death looks like, right? And that in different contexts, it'll take on different textures, but we're dealing with the same sorts of structural problematics.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate this question. I mean, the answer is that not much. Right. Folks don't know much about what's going on here. To be honest with you, you shouldn't assume that folks in the U.S. know much about what's going on in the U.S. either.
Right.
You know, I'm just keeping it real. You know, 257 Black folks have been murdered by police in the U.S. already this year. Right? 245 of them have been Black men. Right. And so, and you have to also understand this in the context of some of the other things that Akala is talking about. You know, the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration has removed 1.5 million Black men during the most during the height of their earning potential out of communities across the United States. The situation in the United States is a dire situation. And so there's a number of people, Black folks, who either check out, right? And then it's a small percentage of folk who are actually engaged in the movement. Now, we try to do different things to try to get the word out and try to be more informative. And I think you know, the movement for Black Lives has shown that we can use social media and use different tools to do that. But we would be mistaken to think, one, that most Black folk in the U.S. are informed about all these issues, even in the U.S. But two, we have to understand like what is really going on. Like there, you know, in some communities, in some situations, there are extremely powerful, systematic, oppressive forces diabolically focused on diminishing Black life. And they're very, very successful right now. And so we're here to learn, right? We're here to learn and try to learn a little bit more. And I think, you know, there's great potential in making this movement more global, but we've got to make it more global with the understanding of like what's at stake and what people are confronted with where they are and how difficult it is to even raise awareness around local communities and where we are about what's going on right in certain cities in the U.S.
I think that's exactly right. And one of the worst, I mean, definitely, I think that the intellectual exchange across that Atlantic divide, that hip hop is doing it, right? Like Jay-Z and Kanye are spending more time over here. I don't know if they're spending time in the right areas, right? That's another conversation. But I think that intellectual dialogue back and forth is really important because we also in the US don't want to assume that Blackness takes on a similar kind of dimension here, right? Like Blackness might look different ways, not only phenotypically, right? But that Muslims, as I mentioned earlier, religion hadn't been mentioned at all, right? But like Muslims, the managing of Muslim difference here and in various parts of Europe are problematic. And it would be what I would call a condition of niggerization, right? And refugees and different types of things in the optics of surveillance, right? So just because there's not Michael Browns, you know, every 28 hours, perhaps, there are things going on here that do connect it as a global movement, and we need to share knowledge, whether that's virtually, whether that's in the cipher and building, you know, again, thanks to the constituents that made this conversation possible, we need to continue that. And Dr. Peterson has an excellent point. There are folk in the U.S. not even aware of what's happening in the U.S. itself, so it's a layered issue.
Well, I would say if you want to get to know more, there's a fantastic documentary by a filmmaker called Ken Farrow called Injustice. It's on Vimeo. You can watch it. It looks at 9 particular cases of state murder of Black folks in this country where juries have returned a verdict of unlawful killing, yet the state has still refused to prosecute. There's been many more since. The film was made in the early 2000s or late 90s. There's been many more since, but I wouldn't be fooled by the fact that police in the UK don't have guns. They still do a very good job of killing people when they get into their custody. That said, I don't think we should say the problem is exactly the same or the same extremity. But in terms of mass incarceration, numbers are very similar in terms of the disproportionate amount that Black folk make in prisons here. So even if the manifestation is particular, which it certainly is, even if the fact that there's a welfare state in Britain means poverty is not as extreme in America as it is in America, and there's various differences, systematically, there are very similar issues. What I will say though, 2 things, and I'll come to your question as well, sis. I've heard a lot of statements about intersectionality, but I think there's one gaping hole we've missed in all the conversations around that issue. If we're not connecting violence against Black and brown bodies inside the Western world itself with the violence that the states of the West do to Black and brown bodies globally, including with Obama in the White House, who seems to think it's perfectly acceptable to bomb countries in Africa. For those who don't know, Libya was bombed by NATO, sanctioned by Mr. Obama. And the groups that were supported by NATO in Libya explicitly murdered an entire town full of Black people, a place called Tawerga in Libya. This is stuff you can look up. It's on the internet. It's very well researched. So I think if we're not connecting the violence that the American and British states do externally with the violence they do to us internally, are we lending credence to the idea that because of our proximity to whiteness, that our black lives are worth more than black lives that are not in closer proximity to whiteness? So I think we have to make that connection. In terms of the States, it's funny, it's weird, because I went to New York in the summer. I went to Afro-Punk Festival. You're all probably very jealous. It was incredible. Most of you probably don't know, it's two brothers from Hackney who started that festival. I met them. It's two London brothers, two East London black youths from Hackney who started Afro-Punk Festival. They're probably going to get annoyed with me because they don't want the whole world to know that. Because in the States, probably everyone thinks it's an American festival. And over here, people would be hating on them because like, how are you going to go America and start a big old festival? You know, people hate, innit? And they're from the hood as well, so it's all of that, right? But I was surprised, to be honest with you, what social media has done. Walking through New York, it was like being in London. Like, people was like, right, that's Akala. And I was shocked because obviously it was after the Frankie Boyle thing and the Guardian video and then some of the music I'd done. But I was surprised the degree to which, obviously, Afro-punk is a particular type of black space. Obviously, there's non-black people there, but it's a majority black festival. For those who don't know, it was Lenny Kravitz, Grace Jones, Lauryn Hill, Gary Clark Jr. I'm not trying to make you jealous. That I went to watch. But obviously, that's a particular type of black people who would attend that kind of event. So obviously, in that niche, I was surprised the degree to which myself, Loki, others are crossing the Atlantic. But obviously, major record labels are not going to start promoting that cross-cultural dialogue around these forms of injustice. That's not in their interest. So we have to tore off our own backs and keep our independence.
And I think the important thing about intersectionality is that it's a flow. It's a global exchange of knowledge. And I think art and music and aesthetics and also just travel and imposing certain distances against themselves so that we can open up spaces of conversation. And they don't need to be competitions. They don't need to be scaled. We don't need to hierarchize particular moments that Black death is worse over here and sexuality is a little bit better over here and race is worse. No, they're all literally a part of the same system. And I think that that was part of the piece that came out of today's conversation.
Also, can we keep an eye on the time? Because the last train to London is at 9:32. And I wasn't planning to stay. I weren't planning to stay in Nottingham tonight. But shit happens, innit? It is what it is. But I'm just saying.
Quick. Okay, my question, I'm gonna keep it really, keep it really real. All you guys on the stage, very, you're well educated, you're on point. But my fear is the Black Lives Movement. What we need, what I can see, what we need is education from a infant level, because we are dealing with white supremacy globally. People aren't even aware of what the game is. You cannot win if you don't know that you're in a game. And that's, my question to you on the panel is, we need to have a unity where we don't have any women, men. We need to be focused on the idea and execute and action it. So, have you got any ideas of where we're going to take this Black Lives Matter movement? What kind of proposals, regarding, beating the system, because it is a system and it needs to be destroyed,
I think there's multiple sites one can occupy. And I think that's part of what I was getting at in my in my commentary and what I'm offering to it. We're not going to all be in the street. We're not going to all be in the classroom. We're not going to all, try and contribute to the intellectual archive and building those things up. I mean, we do programming at Lehigh where we're bringing, Angela Davis and Nas in conversation, and then we're inviting the public. We're trying to go out into the public. I think that it's multidimensional, right? And it doesn't look a particular way, right? But in terms of, strategy, thinking about it as kind of like an art of war, right? There's multiple positions. And I think that it's extremely dangerous if we begin to pit particular positions over and against themselves, right? Like that one is more authentic because they're holding up a sign versus doing a different kind of work, say, for example, in this space or in another space. There's multiple fronts, and education in the grassroots level is very important.
Yeah, I'm an educator, so education is everything for me. I mean, I hope that as people are asking us questions, I hope you understand that, you have to put those questions to yourself, right? Because the reality is like, I'm not really anything special. You know what I'm saying? I'm from Newark, New Jersey. I stayed in school. You know what I mean? I try to work hard. Some people maybe say I work a little bit too hard, but I do the work that's in front of me and where I'm invited to go. And a lot of times that is education-based work. One of the things that's a feature of the Movement for Black Lives is books and breakfasts, right? I don't know if you guys do that here, but in Philly, we do books and breakfasts, and we do it across the US. And what that is people volunteering their time to sit with young people and read to them, to sing with young people, to teach young people about history and systems of oppression. But again, it's not enough people involved in the movement. It's not about somebody sitting on a stage. It's about what are y'all gonna do? And the education piece is the key to it. It is what will sustain the movement. But you try to tell young people the value of being a teacher, and that's a tough sell for young people. Young people want to be doctors, lawyers, or rappers, no offense, right? But they don't want to be teachers, you know what I'm saying? I'm not going to get rich being a teacher, but I am going to change lives and I'm going to save some lives. And so I think the onus is on us as a community and on individuals to place a premium on how and where and why we need to value education. And that's a movement that's a little bit beyond the movement for Black Lives, to be honest with you. But again, I'll just give you a quick example. There are students in a small town close to where we work called Allentown. These are young students, mostly Latino students, who staged a week-long walkout. Their school system is so jacked up that they staged this week-long walkout. This is something very, very difficult for them to do. It means they had to put their grades on the line. These are young people in middle school and high school. They had to put their grades on the line. They had to be fed because they couldn't get lunch. These are all Title I, which means they all have to go to school just to eat. Right? That's how poor they are. And the call went out for academics to come out and help and support and help them by teaching in, give them some informal classes and work with them. And a lot of people said, yeah, I'm gonna come out. When I went out there wasn't any other academics out there. You see what I'm saying? And so it's a lot of, we get together and we talk and blah, blah, that's all well and good, but there's work to be done. And when it comes to education, it's work that a lot of us can do. You know what I mean? But we have to put a value on it. For young people, you have to really consider careers in education. We can't talk about the fact that teaching populations are predominantly white, but nobody Black wants to be a teacher. Right? There's no pipeline for people to become educators. And so you're right in identifying that's an important piece of it. And it's really, I think, the heart of how the movement could be sustainable. But until we place a different premium on what education means, and why we need to be a part of it in every way possible. That's volunteering in the community, helping, supporting the movements, but also becoming educators. Then that's a hard road to sow.
And for the students in the room, if you're in classrooms and your professors, got Marx and Weber and all those other folk on there, and they ain't got Fanon or Tupac or Nicki Minaj or whoever or Akala, ask them to put it on the syllabus, and that's how we create, I think, that long history of the archive that does a lot of important work too.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to allow Akala to answer this last question. This will have to be the last question, I'm afraid. So we're going to wrap up at 9. We need to do this. Tomorrow, after this workshop, and quite a few of our speakers from today's event will be at the this workshop. We'll be answering questions like that. What is it that we can do in a practical way to take forward some of the thoughts and some of the ideas that we've been exploring today. This October Dialogues is just with kids. Christmas will take you to the train station. Here you will get to your train
No, I've got half an hour and it's 1 minute around the corner. I wasn't scared.
Yeah, they will.
Yeah, let's come. I don't know what the question is yet. Are we going to allow someone to ask one more question? No, I think they dealt with that question adequately. So we could ask one more person to ask the final question.
Very, very quickly, I will, because we're talking about intersectionality and building borders across within our own struggle in order to get a better attack against the ruling hegemony. But in relation to that, I was looking, Angela Davis's thing of race, class, and gender. Do you see that could be applicable with variations? And if so, what variations could you encompass in those 3 magic circles that she overlapped, in her book? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay. In terms of strategy.
But we're supposed to kick it to Akala. I'm very familiar with the book.
Okay. Cool.
I'm not very familiar with the book, so I won't be able to answer that question. I'm familiar with the concepts of race, class, and gender, and I'm familiar with Angela Davis.
Question for Akala.
I should have just left you to it and answered that question.
There's a question over here.
Sorry, bro. No, I shouldn't ask one yet.
To circle back to the question from the beginning, we had two different responses to how to respond to the word nigger and other similar words. One saying, don't respond to hatred, and the other saying, just hit him. But as a girl who grew up in a predominantly white area, 4'10", there's nothing of me. I can't just hit someone. So it's very hard to not feel like you're going to victimize yourself no matter what you say. Sure. So how would you suggest that other people who don't feel... I
did preface my comment with "if you fancy the odds." I didn't tell anyone to go out and just.
But if you don't fancy the odds, do you just bite your tongue? What do you do?
Then you're going to live psychically with the scars of not responding. I'm saying my mum's 4'10" and her dad's about as racist as a human being could possibly be, and she spent her life rebelling against him and was punished very brutally for it often. Abuse of, and I'm not saying that means you should suffer abuse. I'm just saying the abuse of people by bullies is not new. And unfortunately with bullies, and this applies to globally what we're talking about, bullies only learn when they get their ass whipped. And if we look globally at the system of European hegemony, and America is its offshoot, and we look at how our government's kissing China's ass at the moment, now China's in the country, we can learn a thing or two about what happens. Power only respects power. And I would close on this, that I think for all the social movements we have against white supremacy, against European colonialism, against patriarchy and all these other forms, we're talking about Black lives specifically. There will always be racism as long as there are not Black societies capable of militarily, politically, and economically defending the Black population. And if we look historically at how white supremacy came to evolve, when the Portuguese and other Europeans first came to Africa, they were not racist because they found Black societies militarily, economically, and politically capable of defending themselves. The early parts of trade between Europeans and Africans were ivory, pepper, other forms of commodity, of which human beings were only a small part. If we look at the Greeks in ancient Egypt, they did not consider themselves superior to Africans because Africans were their teachers. If we look at the Spanish interaction with the Moors, they did not consider themselves superior to Moors because the people they were interacting with were not at a lower economic, political, and economic state. So unfortunately, I think we can only at best put a plaster over the wound of what is a bigger global conflict and understanding the way in which the ideas or the ideology of white supremacy evolved in that catastrophic interaction between African and European civilization, I think will give us a better strategy in the long term of how we can develop or be part of a movement towards reducing the deficit between the West's ability to do violence to the rest of the world and not. The kind of abuses that used to happen to Chinese people in America when they couldn't vote, which did happen, when they were being lynched, which did happen, when they were used to build railroads, which did happen, are not going to happen today. Why? I've been to Chinatown and seen people cause trouble in London, and the police come and bust your head, not the Chinese people's head who are beating the guy up on the floor, drag the guy out and be like, what are you causing trouble for? There will not be an Africa town in London anytime soon, because we don't command that level of respect. I'm not saying everything China does is perfect, by the way. What I'm saying is it's unfortunate humans seem incapable, at least at the highest levels of power, of respecting anything but equal capacity to do violence. Let's just look on who's on the UN Security Council. So we can plead and we can march and we can organize, but I think also we've got to be honest with ourselves. If we look at how countries in Africa got their independence, most of them got it by the gun. If we look at how transatlantic slavery ended, Haitian Revolution, Sam Sharp in Jamaica, and I'm not advocating violence. What I am saying is, I don't consider resistance violence, by the way. I'm not saying we need to be out in the streets burning stuff, but what I am saying is we have to situate ourselves within a realistic sense of this conflict. And I think fooling ourselves into believing we can embarrass the state into being nice. They're not even nice to working class white people. Incidentally, I will close on this point. You were mentioning about free school meals. Our government has just announced here they're going to take free school meals out of the schools in the UK. Wow. And that ain't just black kids who's going to be affected by that. As someone who grew up on free school meals, I'm a bit offended by that. So the violence that is happening, as what Baldwin says, as the world struggles to continue to be white, there is going to be more violence. How do people reconcile the idea that you're superior with, oh, my government is bowing to China when they come to England? How are you going to reconcile you're taught you're superior, but India has just sent a rocket to Mars for 10% of the cost that NASA did it while it's still a third world country? The world is no longer white, but it seems we haven't realized that and we haven't organized ourselves accordingly. And certainly our states are going to do the best to hide that from us. So I think we have to take a historical view also.
Absolutely.
Can we just thank Zoe and the organizers and everyone for coming?
I don't want to resort to brute force here, but I am a black belt in karate.
Why not?
I kid you not. So we are going to end there. I'm not, people who know me, I'm not a person who does the round of thanks. I'm not. If somebody wants to do that, it's fine. Somebody always gets left off. And, people have been thanked several times. And people know who've done the work. You do not need to be thanked. No one needs to thank me. No one needs to thank the team. They know what they have done. They don't need it. So I will say a collective thank you to everybody who's taken part in today. I will invite you again to tomorrow's event right here at 10 o'clock. I hope to see many of you. Once more, give some love and respect for our panel.